In the annals of monsters that have had quasi-blanket or full blanket protection from card effects, most are understandably reviled. But one, Legendary Exodia Incarnate, has basically been forgotten. Let us, for the moment, build a deck for the so-called most powerful monster in Yu-Gi-Oh!, at least as far as canon is concerned. Legendary Exodia Incarnate, the manifestation of Exodia in full form, is unaffected by all card effects. Thus, it can only be removed from the field by a kaiju or kaiju-like monster or via battle. Technically, a card like Evenly Matched can remove it from the field, but who's going to banish Exodia in favor of keeping some non-Exodia card? Exodia's attack power is based on the number of pieces in the graveyard and has the mandatory effect of adding one piece in the graveyard to the hand during your end phase. Basically, it weakens itself by 1,000 attack during each of your end phases. The draw effect, when it is destroyed, is nice, but not really valuable or important unless it's very late game and you're trying to just fish for that actual Exodia victory rather than letting Legendary Exodia Incarnate do the work for you. In a moment of intelligent archetype design, Legendary is paired with a rather effective, albeit somewhat name inappropriate, trap card, Obliterate. Why name inappropriate? Because when I think of Exodia obliterating something, I don't think the end result being, oh look, a gust of wind showed up and bounced your monster back into the hand. No, I think, wow, that card just got annihilated and should never be used in the duel ever again, or any of its cohorts. I would have loved to see Obliterate basically be something like target one monster on the field, banish that monster face down, and no other copies of that monster can be summoned for the remainder of the duel by either player. That's Obliteration. But what can you do? Name notwithstanding, Obliterate activates as a continuous version of compulsory evacuation device that can bounce monsters on either side of the field back to the hand, and only requires sending an Exodia card to the graveyard from the deck, which thins the deck nicely of, let's be honest, most of the time you don't want to be drawing those pieces, and powers up Legendary on the field. A nice thing about Obliterate is that you can always target Legendary to send a piece to increase its attack power by 1,000 to do more damage or stave off battle destruction. Also, when Obliterate is sent to the graveyard, you can recover any Exodia monster, including Legendary, from the graveyard and add it to your hand, which provides some strategy to planning how you might actually remove Obliterate from the field to maximize your ability to put Legendary on the field in the first place. Or you could even remove it and try to win with the old school Exodia method of adding that final piece from the graveyard to your hand, because Legendary has already added a bunch of pieces to your hand to begin with during the course of the duel. Due to a concern of bricking because of the special summoning condition associated with Legendary, the need to tribute a Forbidden One card, and Legendary being somewhat soft early, I only run one copy of Legendary and 3 corresponding copies of Obliterate, along with the obvious 5 pieces of Exodia. I think it's a little risky to run 2 copies of Legendary due to the higher brick probability, but it's workable, and it's just downright silly, I think, to run 3 copies because of the general difficulty the deck has to dump pieces into the graveyard to provide meaningful attack power. While most builds I've seen of this archetype in the past attempt the generic stall strategy, I run Battle Faders, I run Wabakus, I run Threatening Roars, I might run Messenger of Peace. I just think that's really bad design for this particular archetype because it just lets the opponent accumulate resources, and Legendary is not going to win the day against consistent 3 to 5 monster boards, which your opponent's just going to be stacking up and dropping whenever he or she wants. Fortunately, deck speed is easily accomplished, in addition to some nice side benefit searching, with the solid hybrid archetype for this deck of spellbooks. It was true even before the release of Knowledge that spellbooks was a great pairing for Legendary. Now with Knowledge, the deck has simply just become even faster. So, tackling the spellbook portion of this deck, the only monster I run is 3 copies of Spellbook Magician of Prophecy. My initial build ran 1 World and 1 High Priestess, and then just 1 High Priestess, and I just got very little play out of both of those cards, so I just dropped them. Some people may wonder why I don't run Justice, because it could search out Legendary, but if I'm not running Priestess, if I'm not running World, I'm running only 1 copy of Legendary. 1 copy of Justice is inefficient and potentially bricky. Multiple copies of Justice then become quasi-bricky, because outside of getting that search, Justice really isn't a good card. And again, searching for Legendary before you have enough pieces in the grave is almost pointless in a sense. For the spells, I run 3 copies of Spellbook of Secrets, 3 copies of Spellbook of Knowledge, 1 copy of Spellbook of the Master, 1 Spellbook of Fate, 1 Spellbook of Life, and 1 Grand Spellbook Tower. Tower is rather nice in this build because it is a somewhat high priority target for removal by the opponent, because your opponent does not want you to continue to gain these quasi +1s off Tower as the duel goes along. Therefore, in a sense, it takes the bullet in an earlier capacity for something that you might later put on the field, like an Obliterate. Rounding out the monsters, I run 2 copies of Silent Magician, which is rather useful in this deck, providing a secondary heavy hitter that is much easier to put on the field than High Priestess, that can also annoy the heck out of the opponent by negating spell cards. Also, I run 3 copies of Fairy Tale Luna, because this deck can really struggle with quality field presence. And if the opponent can swarm in any real capacity, it can be hard for Legendary to clean up the board by himself. I really like 3 copies of Dragodies, the Empowered Warrior, for its attack reduction based pendulum effect, which really helps a 2,000 to 3,000 attack Legendary stay on the field, as well as the search effect when it is destroyed as a monster. 1 copy of Maxx for obvious reasons. Finally, I run 2 copies of Eater of Millions for additional monster removal. Rounding out the spells, I run 1 copy of Raigeki for field clearance, along with 1 copy of Monster Reincarnation, which works well for scooping out the right monster in the right situation. More often than not, it's either going to be a spellcaster to use with Knowledge, or Legendary, which I can dump into the graveyard with Obliterate, and then get back later for almost a somewhat faster search cycle. Finally, I run 1 Upstart Golbin to just get that consistency, although one could run 1 Magic Planter if you feel kind of lucky in a sense, because I only run 3 continuous traps in this build, but Magic Planter can definitely be a useful card. It's sending off that Obliterate to the graveyard, getting 2 draws, and then getting Obliterate's graveyard effect if you didn't use its bounce effect that turn. For the remaining traps, I run 1 copy of Torrential Tribute, and we have 3 remaining deck spots. Obviously, if you can afford them, running 3 copies of Evenly Matched is probably the best choice. Otherwise, I run 3 copies of Storming Mirrorforce, something that can help neutralize swarms as well as protect Legendary. Overall, as I mentioned before, the extra deck is kind of meaningless for this particular build. One can just throw in the cheapest 15 extra deck monsters one can find to fuel Eater. With this in mind, I had number 78 via a pair of Exodia pieces as it summons, because it's not out of the question that you can get 2 Exodia pieces on the field at the same time to make number 78. My extra deck is as followed: 2 copies Superdreadnought Rail Cannon Super Dora, 1 copy Gaia Dragon the Thunder Charger, 3 copies number 28 Titanic Moth, 3 copies number 24 Dragon Nosferatu Dragulas, 2 copies number 61 Volcasaurus, 3 copies number 54 Lionheart, and 1 copy number 78 Number Archive. Running multiple copies is just not worth it, because realistically you're only going to get Number Archive off once per duel. Overall, despite the lack of actual support Legendary has, and Exodia in general, outside of degenerate generic draw loops, this deck works fairly well against a number of decks that do not run a heavy contingent of kaijus. Not surprisingly, this deck can have a clunky first turn, largely consisting of drawing and setting up some back row defense due to the normal summons competition between the Exodia piece for legendary summoning and either Blue Boy or Fairy Tales. One useful tip that some may not think about is that legendary can be summoned by tributing a set Exodia piece. So when preparing to summon legendary, it's probably better to set the piece rather than summon it. So your opponent doesn't really know what's going on, because if you summon it, your opponent might say, oh, crud, why is he doing that? I'm just going to bounce it back to your hand with my Firewall Dragon or some of the effect. If you set it, your opponent's going to be confused. They'll say, why is he doing that? And then, bam, you special summon legendary, and now Firewall Dragon's worthless. Unfortunately, from the standpoint of competitiveness, this deck is not quite there, because there is not enough support to help dump Exodia pieces into the graveyard quickly, thus thereby actually making legendary a meaningful threat in the early game. Also, this deck has some level of problems dealing with swarm boards, because legendary can only swing once per turn. Overall, right now, centering around legendary is a little too dependent on Obliterate to be effectively competitive, because Obliterate is by far and away the most effective card to put those pieces in the graveyard. However, this deck definitely has its moments. Well, that is my Legendary Exodia Incarnate deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.